The apology folded inside Adeline Hartley's glove had been written in her mother's hand, and not one word of it was true. She knew this the way she knew most things in her family, quietly, completely, and without anyone ever asking whether she'd noticed. The wagon jolted along the Wexbridge Road with the particular meanness of an October that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, and she kept her spine straight against the seat and her eyes on the gray water of the lake, showing through the seaters. And she turned the small folded paper over once with her thumb. She did not need to read it again. She had read it 3 times the night before, sitting at the kitchen table after the house had gone to sleep, with a single candle and the cold coming up through the floorboards into her stocking feet. We wish to express our deepest regret for any distress occasioned to the Hollis family, and to assure them that no slight was ever intended. No slight was ever intended, as though her sister had stumbled into ruining a good man's name the way a person stumbles on an icy step. As though it had been weather, and not will. Adeline was 26 years old, married 14 months, and on this particular afternoon, she was being sent the 8 miles to the Hollis farm to make her family's peace, because she was the respectable one now. That was the phrase her mother used, the respectable one. It meant married. It meant safely disposed of, set down into the household of Mr. Gideon Hartley, like a parcel into the right pigeonhole, no longer a problem requiring solutions. A married daughter could be sent to apologize and it would mean something, because a married woman had standing. An unmarried one carried only the family's shame, and her sister Beatrice carried enough of that for the both of them already. You'll keep it short, her mother had said that morning, pinning Adeline's collar with hands that did not shake, because Auguste Crane's hands never shook over anything that mattered to anyone but herself. You'll be gracious. You will not, under any circumstances, explain. There is nothing to explain. There was a misunderstanding, the engagement is dissolved, and we are all of us very sorry for the unpleasantness. That is all. Do you understand me, Adeline? Yes, mother. Can't go. She's not well enough. Beatrice was perfectly well. At the moment her mother said this, Beatrice was upstairs in the room the 2 sisters had once shared. Lying across the bed she now had to herself, reading and rereading a letter from a man in Toronto who did not yet know a single true thing about her. She had been not well enough for 6 weeks, ever since the engagement to Daniel Hollis had come apart, and her poor health permitted her a great many things. Late mornings, the better cuts of meat, the family's collective sympathy, while permitting her none of the consequences. Adeline had stopped resenting it. Resentment took effort, and she had learned young that the effort was better spent elsewhere. What she had spent it on these 6 weeks was the truth. She had it now, in the second pocket beneath the first, where the apology was not. She had 3 letters in Beatrice's own hand, retrieved one at a time from places her sister was careless about, because Beatrice had never once in her life imagined that quiet Adeline might be paying attention. She had dates. She had the name of the man in Toronto, and the dates lined up against the dates. Beatrice had stood in their parlor weeping, and telling their parents that Daniel Hollis had behaved toward her in a manner no decent man would, that he had said things, made suggestions, that she could not in conscience marry such a person, and they must understand. They must protect her, they must not press her for the particulars, because the particulars were too shameful to speak. There had been no particulars. There had been a man in Toronto with a good coat and a better income, and a country fiancé who farmed his own land and read his Bible, and was, by every account Adeline had ever heard, exactly as honest as he appeared. Beatrice had wanted out, and rather than simply ask for it, she had burned the man down on her way through the door, because a broken engagement reflected poorly on a girl unless the girl could prove the man had deserved breaking. So she had proven it. With her mouth. And the town had believed her, because the town loved a story about a respectable family, wronged far more than it loved Daniel Hollis, who kept to himself and didn't drink, and had never given anyone a single interesting thing to say about him. Adeline had watched a good man's name go gray in the mouths of her neighbors over the course of a single autumn, and she had said nothing, because nothing was what she'd been raised to say. And then her father had come to her, 3 days ago, and told her she would carry the family's apology to the Hollis farm, and she had understood with a kind of cold clarity that there was a difference between holding your tongue and being made into an instrument of the lie. They were not sending her to be silent. They were sending her to seal it. To stand in Daniel Hollis's mother's front room and, with the full weight of a married woman's word, confirm that it had all been a sad misunderstanding and no one was truly to blame. She would not do it. She had known she would not do it from the moment her father set down his coffee and would not look at her while he said it. The wagon came up over the last rise, and the Hollis place opened out below. A tidy frame house with a stone foundation, a long bank barn, the orchard behind it heavy with the last of the apples and a few not yet picked, going soft and brown on the branch. Smoke stood straight up from the chimney into a sky that had finally settled on being clear. There were other rigs already in the yard. Of course there were. This was not a private call. Her mother had timed it, with the precision Augusta brought to all her cruelties, to coincide with the Hollises' harvest supper, when half the township would be there to witness the Crane family's gracious gesture of regret. A public apology. A public sealing. Adeline understood, looking down at the lit windows and the buggies, that she had been sent not to a room but to a stage, and Mr. Hartley would be there. Her husband. He had ridden out earlier in the day on business with the elder Hollis about a stand of timber, and would stay for the supper, and so the wagon her father had hired would carry her home alone in the dark, while Gideon followed on his own horse. She had not spoken to her husband about any of it. She rarely spoke to her husband about anything that lived below the surface of the weather and the household accounts. 14 months of marriage, and she could have counted on her fingers the times he had told her something she hadn't already known about him, which was not many, because there was not much she had ever been permitted to learn. He had married her to settle her father's debt. This was the plain arithmetic of it, understood by everyone, stated outright by no one. Silas Crane had borrowed against a season that failed, and Gideon Hartley held the paper, and somewhere in the negotiations a daughter had been added to the ledger to balance it. Adeline did not flatter herself that there had been any sentiment in it. He was 11 years older than she was, a man of few words and fewer expressions, who ran his mill and his land with a competence that left nothing to chance and nothing, as far as she could tell, to feeling. He was not unkind to her. He had never raised his voice or his hand. He simply did not seem to require her presence in any way that a wife might have wished to be required, and she had stopped after the first months, wishing for it. A person could starve waiting at a closed door. She had decided not to starve. The wagon pulled into the yard. A boy came to take the horse, and Mrs. Hollis herself came out onto the step, drying her hands on her apron, her face arranging itself into the careful blankness that the whole township had learned to wear around the Crane name lately. She was a broad, plain woman with kind eyes gone wary, and Adeline's whole chest ached with the unfairness of what had been done to her family, this woman who had done nothing but raise an honest son. Mrs. Hartley, Mrs. Hollis said. Not Adeline. Mrs. Hartley. The married name, the formal distance, the small correct cruelty of it. We weren't certain you'd come. I said I would, Adeline answered, and stepped down. The supper was already laid when she came in. The long table crowded with the township's families, the smell of roast fowl and bread, and the cider warming on the stove. Conversation snagged for a moment when she entered, and then deliberately resumed, louder. The way a room talks past a thing it has agreed not to look at. She found Daniel Hulse near the window, standing a little apart, a young man with a steady face that had learned in 6 weeks to expect the worst from any room he walked into, and she found, in the same glance, her husband. Gideon Hartley stood by the cold hearth with a cup he wasn't drinking from, and he was already watching her. He did not smile. He almost never smiled. But there was something in the set of his attention that she could not read and did not try to, because she had her own work to do, and she did not have room, just then, for the long unanswerable question of her marriage. The supper went on. She ate little. She answered when she was spoken to and was spoken to seldom. And she watched Daniel Hollis bear the weight of a room full of people who had decided about him, and she watched the elder Mrs. Hollis carry plates and refill cups with a graciousness that cost her visibly, and somewhere between the fowl and the apple pie the moment arrived the way she'd known it would. Mrs. Hollis set down the coffee pot and folded her hands, and said, into a lull, with the dignity of a woman who has rehearsed a hard thing, "We understand Mrs. Hartley has come on behalf of her family. We're willing to hear it." And the room went still and turned toward Adeline, and her mother's words sat ready in her mouth. "No slight was ever intended, a misunderstanding. We are all of us very sorry." And she felt the whole machinery of it waiting for her to pull the lever. 20 faces composed into the expectation of her smallness, and she stood up from the bench. She had thought she might be afraid. She was. Her hands were cold, and her heart went hard and quick under the borrowed respectability of her good wool dress. But fear, she had learned, was not the same as being unable. She had been afraid most of her life, and had done a great many things anyway. "My mother wrote an apology," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "She wrote it in my hand to carry, and I have it here, and I'm not going to read it to you. It isn't true, and I won't stand in this house and seal a lie over the head of an honest man. I owe Mr. Hollis better than that, and so does my family, whether they'll own it or not." The stillness changed temperature. Somebody's chair scraped. Mrs. Hartley. Mrs. Hollis began, uncertain now, the careful blankness cracking. Daniel Hollis did nothing wrong. Adeline made herself say his given name, made herself look at him while she said it, because he deserved to be looked at. "Everything my sister said about him is false." She wanted to be free of the engagement, and rather than break it honestly, she broke him, because a girl who breaks an engagement is pitied only if the man's a villain. So she made him a villain. There was never any improper word, any improper act. There was a man in Toronto she preferred, with a larger income, and there were letters between them all through the spring, while she was promised to your son. And I have 3 of them in my pocket in her own hand, with dates. And I will put them on this table in front of every person here if my word alone is not enough. The room broke open, voices. Mrs. Hollis's hand at her own throat. Daniel Hollis very white and very still by the window, looking at Adeline as though she were something he hadn't believed existed. And under the noise, her own family's name. The Cranes, did you hear? The Crane girl, and she understood. She had just set fire to her parents' careful work and her sister's safety and the whole arrangement by which the family lived behind a respectable face. And she found she did not care. She found she had never in her life cared less about anything. "You can't know that's true," said a man down the table. Old Mr. Vance, who liked his certainties. A married woman turning on her own kin. "That's a hard thing to credit. Where's your proof but your say-so?" And it was here, in the half-second before Adeline reached for the letters, before she could decide whether to lay her family bare in front of 40 people, or trust her word to carry alone, that her husband spoke for the first time all evening. "She has the proof," Gideon Hartley said, "and she didn't have to come here and tell you any of it. There's no profit in it for her. A woman who lies tells the lie that helps her. My wife just told you the one that costs her everything." He had set down his cup. He came around the end of the table and he stood beside her, not in front of her, not over her, beside her, and he said it again, more quietly, to the room. "I'd take her word over any easy story this township's been telling itself since August, and I'd advise the rest of you to do the same." Adeline looked up at him, and for the length of one held breath the whole evening dropped away, and there was only the strangeness of his being there, at her shoulder, when she had not asked it, and could not have expected it, and had walked into the room certain she would face it alone. She laid the letters on the table. She did it gently, the way you set down something that has cost you to carry. Mrs. Hollis read the first one with a hand pressed flat to her mouth, and then she read it aloud, the part that mattered, in a voice that shook, and the room that had decided about Daniel Hollis sat in the wreckage of having decided wrong, and the young man by the window put his face in his hands. Not from grief, but from something far harder to bear, which was relief. Arriving 6 weeks late, the drive home was hers alone, as her mother had arranged, but Gideon did not follow at a distance. He tied his horse to the back of the wagon, climbed up beside her, took the reins out of her hands without a word, and turned them onto the dark road toward home, with the lake on their left, throwing back the last gray light, and the geese going over somewhere high and unseen, calling south. For a long time neither of them spoke. The cold came up. He reached behind the seat without looking and pulled the wool blanket across her knees, and she let him. "They'll come to the house," she said finally. "My mother and father. There'll be." She didn't know what there'd be. "It will be bad. It might. You stood up in front of the whole township and called my family liars." "I stood up," he said, "and agreed with my wife." The simplicity of it sat between them in the dark. She turned to look at him, the blunt profile she'd lived beside for 14 months, and never once seen do anything she could not have predicted. And she found she had to ask, even at the cost of how much it revealed. "Why?" she said. You don't." She stopped, started again, with the directness that had cost her so much tonight, and that she found she could not now put down. "I have spent more than a year in your house, thinking you regarded me as a debt that had been settled, a line drawn through an account. You've never once given me reason to think otherwise, and then tonight you crossed a room I'd already made up my mind to stand alone in. So I'd like to understand why, because I've stopped being able to bear not understanding things." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. The wagon wheels found the ruts. Then he said, not looking at her, in the flat careful voice of a man unaccustomed to handing anything over. "I knew what your father was when I took his paper. I knew what your sister was inside a month of being acquainted with this township. I made no assumptions about you, one way or the other, except the one assumption a man makes about a family like that, which is that you'd be the same. And then you came into my house, and I watched you for 14 months. He shifted the reins from one hand to the other. I watched you keep accounts that nobody checked, and keep them honest. I watched you take the worst of every season, without complaint, and the credit for none of it. I watched you be spoken over and stepped past, and sent on every errand nobody else would dirty their hands with. And I never once heard you tell a lie to make yourself look better. Not even the small ones everybody tells. I had a wife who'd been handed to me like a sack of seed, and what I found when I bothered to look was the only honest person I'd met in this country since I came to it. He glanced at her then, just once, in the dark. I'm not a talking man, I know it. My own mother used to say I'd let a house burn down sooner than ask for the loan of a bucket. I didn't know how to tell you any of that, so I didn't tell you anything, and I let you think what you thought, because telling you would have required. He stopped. Started over, lower. It would have required saying out loud that I'd come to want a thing I'd told myself I'd married my way out of needing. So I said nothing. That was cowardice, and it was the one dishonest thing in the whole arrangement. And it was mine. Adeline sat very still with the blanket over her knees and the cold air sharp in her chest and something in her, 14 months frozen, beginning to move. You could have told me tonight was a mistake, she said. You could have ridden home and let me face them and said you'd had no part in it. Most men would have. It would have been the sensible thing, the profitable thing. It would, he agreed. But you'd already done the thing that wasn't profitable, and done it for no reason but that it was true. And a man who watched that happen and then chose the safe road would have to be a particular kind of coward. I'd decided, some while ago, I didn't want to be married to you and still be. He paused. If that makes any sense. It made more before I said it. It made sense. It made more sense than anything had made in 14 months. She laughed, a short, surprised, wet sound she hadn't planned, and put her gloved hand over her mouth. And he looked at her with something in his blunt face she had genuinely never seen there before, which was uncertainty. The open uncertainty of a man who has put a thing down on the table and does not know if it will be picked up. My name is Adeline, she said, into the dark, absurdly, because it occurred to her that in 14 months he had called her Mrs. Hartley in company, and almost nothing at all in private, not Mrs. Hartley. You stood beside me and called me your wife in front of the whole township, and I thought, it's a strange thing to want, after tonight. But I'd like, once, to hear you say my name. He drew the horse up. They sat in the middle of the dark road, with the lake whispering at the bottom of the field, and the cold stars coming out, and he turned on the seat and looked at her properly, the way he had not let himself look at her, across a year of suppers and accounts and careful distance. Adeline, he said. It was only a name. It was the most that had ever passed between them. It went the way she'd told him it would, when it came. Her mother arrived at the Hartley house 2 days later with her father silent behind her, and there was a great deal of talk about ingratitude and ruin, and what would become of them all now. About the disgrace Adeline had brought down on her own blood. About how a daughter who would do such a thing had no natural feeling. Augusta Crane wept the practiced tears that had moved every room she'd ever needed to move, and waited for them to work. They did not work. Adeline stood in her own parlor, in her own house, beside her own husband, and she listened to all of it, and when her mother had finished she said, You sent me to seal a lie over a good man's life, because you'd decided his ruin was a fair price for keeping ours quiet. I won't pretend I didn't understand it, because I did, the whole time. That's the part you can't forgive. Not that I refused, but that you can no longer believe I didn't notice. She was not unkind when she said it. She found, to her own surprise, that she pitied them. Beatrice did a cruel thing and you helped her hide it, and when hiding it stopped being enough you decided to make me the one who buried it. I'm sorry it's cost you. But I won't unsay a true thing to make a false peace, and you may as well stop asking. They left. There was no embrace. Her father, at the door, looked at her for a moment as though he meant to speak, and then did not. And that small failure was the closest thing to an apology she would ever have from him. And she found it was enough, because she had stopped, somewhere on the dark road home, needing them to be other than they were. Beatrice's man in Toronto learned the rest of it within the month. The township is small, and the city is not so far, and stories travel fastest along the routes their tellers least intend. He did not come back. Beatrice spent that winter exactly as ill as she chose to be, and considerably less comfortable than before. For a girl's poor health is only indulged so long as it serves the family's purposes, and she had become the family's purposes' wreckage. Adeline did not gloat over it. She thought of her sister sometimes, in the long evenings, and felt mostly a tired sorrow for a person who had been so frightened of an honest no that she'd reached past it for a lie, and ruined 3 lives reaching, and would likely never understand that the honest no had been the cheaper thing all along. The one she thought of more was Toby. Her brother Tobias was 16, the youngest, with their father's quietness and none of his calculation, and his whole future had been pinned to an apprenticeship under the elder Mr. Hollis, who ran the best joiner's shop in the township and had been willing, before all of this, to take the boy on in the spring. The feud should have ended that. By every law of how these things went, the Hollises had no reason on earth to set up the brother of the girl who'd nearly destroyed their son. Adeline had told the truth knowing it might cost Toby the one good road open to him, and she had told it anyway, and she had not let herself think too hard about that part, because there'd been no help for it. But it was Daniel Hollis who came to the Hartley mill, 3 weeks on, to find her. He stood in the cold yard turning his hat in his hands, the color back in his face, and his name back in the township's good graces, and he said, "I came to say my mother's spoken to my uncle, and the apprenticeship stands. For your brother. In the spring, as it was meant to be." And when Adeline began to say something about how he owed her family nothing, least of all that, he stopped her. "It isn't owed to your family," he said. "It's owed to you. You stood in our front room and put your own people to the fire to give me back my name. The boy's no part of what his sister did, and I won't have him pay for it, and I won't have you think your honesty has to cost a child his future. That's not the kind of country I want to live in. That's not the kind your husband wants either, from what I can tell." He put his hat back on. "Tell Tobias I'll expect him at the shop by the thaw." She watched him ride out, and she stood in the yard a long time in the cold, and that was the moment. Not the dark road, not her name in her husband's mouth, but this, that she understood what she had set loose. She had thought, walking into the Hollis house, that telling the truth was a single act, a door you opened once and walked through. It was not. It was a stone dropped into still water, and the rings of it went out and out, touching people she'd never meant to touch, undoing harms she'd never been asked to undo, and it would go on moving long after she'd stopped being able to see it. She had only ever wanted not to be a liar. She had not understood that being honest, all the way honest, when it cost you, was not a smallness at all. It was the largest thing she had ever done. The marriage that had been an account settled became, over the slow turn of that first true winter, something she had no word for and did not need one. It was not sudden. Gideon Hartley remained a man who would let a house burn before he'd ask for a bucket, and she remained a woman who had taught herself young to want very little out loud. But he began to tell her things. About the mill, about the years before he'd come to Canada West, about his mother and the bucket and the kind of silence he'd been raised inside and was trying, late and clumsily, to learn his way out of. And she began to say the things she'd spent a lifetime swallowing, the small true ones, the ones nobody had ever asked her for. They were both bad at it. They got better. There was a great deal of quiet in that house still, but it had changed its nature entirely, the way a frozen field and a fallow one can look the same and be nothing alike, the one dead and the one only resting until its season. Years on, and there were years. There was the boy who came 2 springs later, and a daughter after, and the orchard Gideon planted along the south fence because she'd once said, on the dark road home, that she'd always wanted to watch a thing grow, that she'd put in the ground herself. Years on. Adeline Hartley would think sometimes of the apology folded in her glove, and the 8 cold miles, and the room full of people waiting for her to be small. She had spent the first 26 years of her life being useful and overlooked. The one who kept the accounts no one read and held the tongue, everyone preferred held. And she had walked into that supper certain of nothing, except that she would not seal the lie. She had not gone to be brave, she'd been frightened the whole way. She had not gone with a plan. She'd had only the one thing that was wholly hers, unborrowed and unsigned by anyone, which was that she would not say a false thing to make a hard thing easier for the people who'd never once made anything easier for her. She had told the truth, and the truth had done what it does when it's finally given room. It had moved. It had cleared an innocent man, and kept a boy's future, and laid bare a family that needed laying bare, and it had crossed a dark room in the shape of a quiet man who'd been waiting, it turned out, only to be given a reason. She had not been rescued. No one had come to save her. She had stood up in a borrowed dignity, and said the one true sentence she had, and then she had kept saying true sentences, season after season, into a marriage and a household and a life, until the borrowed thing wore away entirely, and what was left underneath was simply hers, earned and solid and real and answerable to no one's account but her own. She looked at the life in front of her, the orchard and the lake and the man and the children, and she found nothing in it that she had to lie to keep, and she did not look back.